Good morning, Liberty students. This morning we're continuing in the book of Joshua, and we move to the famous story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. This is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, as the people come and they march around the city and the walls just fall down. It's one of those stories that when you're growing up in church in elementary and preschool, it's an easy story to tell because it's very visual, but we can get used to that just being like a kid's story. But this story is filled with the riches of God's goodness and grace, but also some heavy themes like God's strange plans for our future, as well as God's justice on evil. But we're going to look at three important things this morning. Number one is God's promise. In Joshua 6:2, God says, "See, I have given Jericho into your hands." And he tells this to Joshua as a promise that he already is going to have victory, even though they haven't fought the battle yet. God even speaks in past tense, "I have given you what is about to happen." And so it's a promise to Joshua and to the people that they are going to have victory. And that's important to remember, that God speaks many of the promises in the Bible as if they are already accomplished, because that's how sure God's promises are. Number two, God's plan. We actually preached through this a few weeks ago in our By Faith series, but we looked at the number 7 is throughout this passage many times. And in Hebrew culture and in the Old Testament, the number 7 is the number of completion or perfection. And a couple of things we pointed out in that message that night was Joshua and the people had to wait on God's perfect timing, and they had to follow God's perfect plan and trust it. But when they trusted his perfect plan and they trusted his perfect timing, they had victory. Even though his plan was unusual and didn't make any sense for a military to do this, they knew that they could trust him. And when they obeyed, they had victory. But number 3 is God's justice. What's heavy about this passage is that God tells them to destroy everything in this city and everyone in this city. And you're going to unpack this more this morning as you read it. Your leaders have some great notes in their lessons about this. But what's important to remember is that this culture in Canaan, particularly in Jericho, was filled with idol worship. And it's not just God was mad about idol worship, it's what they did in the worship of these idols. One, that God is only worthy, he's the only one worthy of glory and of worship. So worshiping idols is a sin against God. But also the way they worshiped these idols was child sacrifice and sexual immorality of multiple different kinds. And so this kind of thing ran rampant in their culture, and God had warned them for years to repent and turn away, but they did it. And so God used giving his people victory and fulfilling his promise to them to also bring holy justice upon a sinful people who would not turn from extreme evil. So don't be afraid to ask tough questions in this passage. There's a lot going on here with Joshua and the people and Rahab and God's justice and God's promise and God's plans. There's a lot of great stuff here to dive into. So I hope you'll enjoy it this morning and have a great study.